Hi, I'm Tyler, and this is the Stock Scores Market Minutes for January 15th, 2018. This week we'll talk about the often used trading cliche, buy the rumor, sell the news. I'll do my regular weekly market analysis, and of course the trade of the week, this time on SGRP. You know, stocks that move up in anticipation of important news usually sell off when the news is out, and it really doesn't matter whether the news is good or bad. The reality is that expectations outstrip the reality most of the time. And once the news is out, all of the people that bought in anticipation of the news, well, their reason for owning the stock is gone. And that is why we have that saying, buy the rumor, sell the news. When stocks move up in anticipation of an announcement, if you are a trader, it's a good idea to take the profit and run. You'll probably be able to buy it back cheaper later. All right, let's get into this week's market analysis. And here is a chart of the S&P 500 going back 30 days here. And whoops, the upward trend pretty strong over the last 2 weeks. You can see we're in a nice upward sloping channel after breaking out to start the year. So the buyers are in control in the short term. Looking at the longer term, you can see that there's some reason for concern because the upward trend is actually going parabolic. And that means that the trend is curving upwards from left to right. So if I draw a line across here, you can see that we are now far above that trend line as that trend gets steeper and steeper. And that is a sign that investors are getting emotional and chasing stock prices higher. That usually comes before a pullback, some sort of correction. Now that does not mean that we will get a correction next week. We can have a market go parabolic for months before it happens. But it does mean that you should dance close to the exit door and keep a close eye on a break of the upward trend line on the most aggressive means of measuring it. Moving along to the Russell 2000, it is not in that same long-term steep upward trend, but it is going to new highs, so that is a positive. You can see here the break this week to new highs. We've got rising bottoms. That is a sign of optimism. So no reason to be a seller here. In fact, you want to be a buyer of the small caps, but realize also that if the large caps do pull back, we'll probably see a pullback in sympathy in the small caps. Onto the Canadian market, which is not keeping pace with the US market. You can see that it is not enjoying the same kinds of gains the past couple of weeks since the start of the year as the US market. Not to say that it's doing poorly. It is got rising bottoms, and in general, the trend is up. Just not doing as well as the US side. So we may see that improve as oil prices have been strengthening. We saw some good strength in gold, and of course there's a heavy weighting in those commodity stocks on the Canadian market. But for now, this market is underperforming the US. And looking at the longer term weekly chart, you see that we don't have that parabolic trend that we have in the US. Now that's not really a bad thing because it also means there's less risk here, because we don't have that emotional buying pressure. So I think this market is a hold. It's generally in an upward trend, but it's not as euphoric as the US side. Now we do see some euphoria on the TSX Venture because of cannabis stocks and mining stocks all having done quite well in the last few weeks. We're getting some pretty strong price action. And although I think we could see a little bit of a pullback in the short term, there's no reason to think that this is going to end. We made what's called a bursting bubble candle there, where we hit a new high, closed below the open for the week. But we've held up quite well this past week, and I think this market probably can continue higher, although you have to be pretty stock specific in how you trade these in this particular market. The Treasury bond got a little bit of attention last week because it broke the, or yields jumped up when prices for bonds fell lower, and you can see the little fall lower right there, but it didn't hold through the end of the week. That's why there's a long tail on that candle. So we're just barely holding the upward trend line. I wouldn't say that we've made a strong break of it. Volume did increase last week, and so there is some sensitivity to perhaps the bond market starting to move lower. We heard some comments from Bill Gross, who is a bond heavyweight, saying the 25-year bull market in bonds is over. Maybe so. The chart is starting to show that, but I wouldn't say it's definitive just yet. And the US dollar, an important chart because it had a pretty big week to the downside. It continues to stay below that downward trend line. But what's interesting here that we have to watch for this week is, does it hold the support and make a double bottom and then try to retest that downward trend line? So that's what I would watch for. I do think there's a good chance that the US dollar bounces next week. The question is it just a bounce, or will we actually resolve with a break of the downward trend line? Now, that weakness in the US dollar helps things like gold go higher, and you can see gold has been moving higher for the past few weeks. It has not really broken through resistance. I would define resistance something like that. And you can see my line doesn't ever want to stay there where I draw it, but you get the idea. It's right at that resistance level. So we'll see if, the US dollar bounces, gold probably moves lower. But if we get a breakdown to new lows for the US dollar, then gold will probably test those highs from the summer of 2017. And here we have the oil chart, which we discussed last week, having broken out through resistance, and it continued higher this week. When you look at the daily chart, you see something of a little bit of a parabolic move on oil, but that's maybe a short-term setup for a little bit of a pullback back to the trend line where it should bounce and continue higher. I do like this chart for oil. I think it continues higher, but as I said, it wouldn't surprise me if we had some short-term profit taking. And the fear chart, really at the lows. Anytime there's a little spike in fear, it never lasts long. We get little spikes. We've talked about this many times, but they tend to just be nothing more than little blips. We'll probably get another one soon, but until we start to see a break from a rising bottom where we, form a rising bottom and then break up from that, I wouldn't get too worried about fear being a factor in the market. So my ratings then, bullish on both time frames for US stocks and Canadian stocks, although certainly the US market outperforming the Canadian. Gold neutral long term, it's right at that resistance level. We will see if it can break it. Bullish short term, as it does have good upward momentum, but getting a little overbought. Speaking of overbought, oil a little bit overbought on the very short term because it has been going parabolic. But in the big picture, looking at that 3-year trend, it still has lots of room to run. U.S. stocks continue to defy gravity, making the trend for the large caps parabolic. Now, small caps are improving. They don't have that parabolic trend, and so are the commodity stocks, which are benefiting from a weakening US dollar. Gold is at resistance, oil has broken out of its range, and fear is low. Let's look at the trade of the week. This is a trade that I featured in my Trade Scores alert service. You can get that at tradescores.com. Featured it back here. Took a little while. I don't always like them when they take this long, but it had a huge jump on Friday, moving all the way up almost to $3.80. Now, when that happens, this is the old buy the rumor, sell the news. When you get that extreme strength and with huge volume, I really get aggressive on the exit. And we ended up exiting this stock up, closer to this area here before it sold off into the close. So sometimes you got to take the money and run when you get those gifts, these stocks that jump up over 100% in a single day. Well, that has been the Stock Scores Market Minutes for January 15th, 2018. Hope that you can like the comment or like the video, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, and most importantly, trade well.